This show is produced by the Hartman Media Company. For more information and links to all our great podcasts, visit hartmanmedia.com.
Hey, brother, I just finished listening to your July 5th episode. Man, I just absolutely love your content, man. It gives me value every time I listen to it. It gives me a different perspective on how I view some of the stuff that I do. It's just always good, man. And I want to keep telling you the same thing over and over and over. It does affect people. It does change people's lives. And really do appreciate all of the effort that you're putting into that, because I know that you really got better things to do than this, but yet you still sacrifice that time and do it. So hats off to you, bro.
Welcome to the Creating Wealth Show with Jason Hartman. You're about to learn a new slant on investing, some exciting techniques, and fresh new approaches to the world's most historically proven asset class that will enable you to create more wealth and freedom than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who's actually been there and done it. He's a successful investor, lender, developer, and entrepreneur who's owned properties in 11 states, had hundreds of tenants, and been involved in thousands of real estate transactions. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to your financial independence day. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
Welcome to episode 2092, and if you like salacious, if you like something with an edge, if you like scandal, that's what today's episode is about. You know, you just can't make this stuff up, can you? All of the absolute ridiculousness and craziness that goes on, all of the corruption, all of the bad behavior in our government, it is really shameful. If you live in the US or you've been keeping track of our news, you know the big story that broke about the sexual escapades right in the place of government. It's absolutely unbelievable. But this is nothing new. This is nothing new in Washington, D.C. These people are living on our money, whether it be our taxpayer money or the debasement of our savings, stocks, bonds, and investments through inflation. Either way, it's our money, right? They are extracting wealth from us and living the life of rock stars. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a rock star, I guess, if that's your thing, but at least a rock star is not funded by the citizens, right? They might live a crazy partying lifestyle, but we don't fund them unless we're buying their concert tickets and their music, which, hey, we probably are. But that's by choice, right? Government is not by choice. And you look at the absolute corruption. You look at like Nancy Pelosi. What a great example, right? She beat every hedge fund. I mean, Nancy Pelosi is the world's best investor. No question about it. She should be hosting this show, not me, because her returns are upwards of 60% annually on her portfolio. We do pretty well with income property, the most historically proven asset class in the entire world. But 60%, we do get that sometimes. We even exceed that sometimes, but not consistently, right? So yeah, there we go. Anyway, we are going to hear from an episode that I did a few years back with a DC madam. Okay, so this is about the Washington, DC madam, and I think this will be really interesting. I know it's not exactly about real estate, but I got some other stuff to talk to you about first. But this is just so salacious. It's a current event. It's the holiday season, so we're thinking a little bit less about business. I know this could have been a 10th episode show, but I think you'll find it interesting nonetheless. Okay, let's get to some real estate stuff. So the good news is the powers that be are reducing the mortgage rates, and the market has already reacted, but the Fed has signaled that mortgage rates will drop pretty significantly into the new year. And what does that mean? That means a whole bunch of people that have been priced out of the market that couldn't afford to buy after these interest rate hikes we've had will now be able to afford to buy. And that affordability is coming into an extremely low inventory housing market with inventory that is approximately half of what it needs to be considered normal. That's just normal. Inventory needs to double to be normal. My prediction is this is going to light the market on fire, where we are going to see much more upward pressure on prices. Look, everybody got it wrong. I was right. The last several years, well, I've been right for decades, but the last several years, and I'm going easily back to 2015, everybody said the market is going to crash. It's over. It's been going too long, coming out of the Great Recession. And they were definitely singing that tune in 2016. They were definitely saying it in 17, 18, and 19 for sure. And for sure, they were saying the end of the world was happening when the COVID era hit, and the complete opposite happened. Then they were all predicting a market crash when the rate hikes occurred. And I guess they don't understand the most basic law of economics, supply and demand, because they simply looked at housing affordability for new buyers, and there are hardly any of those people because the market has been much slower. Only about 5 million people have been affected by the higher rates. But wait, that's actually wrong, because about 40% of the people that have been buying have been cash deals. So they're not even affected by the rates, right? So, okay, just under 3 million people, and many of them, about a third of those, probably investors, or a little less than a third now, investors, right? And many of them new home buyers with buy downs on their mortgages. I mean, these higher rates haven't really affected that many people. Remember, I'm comparing this to about 140 million housing units in the United States. Now, let's get back to the rates declining. We're going to experience massively increased housing affordability. I know. Compared to what? Well, it's definitely not as good as it was during the COVID era, but it's increasing significantly compared to what it's been the last year and a half. And we're doing that into a market that is extremely inventory constricted. We've had appreciation the last year and a half when most people predicted depreciation. What happens when you lower the rates and affordability increases? You take another cut, another cut, another cut. And what I mean is not a cut in rates, but a cut at the unaffordability problem, the housing affordability problem. You keep chipping away at that, and housing becomes more affordable, right? That's exactly what's happening. It's already happened just on words, not actions. Wait till the actions kick in, and we see increased affordability in a low inventory market. Folks, this is simple supply and demand. There is nothing exciting here. I don't have to talk to you about complex stuff. I don't have to talk to you about the repo market or the yield curve. Nobody cares about that. What they care about is their plans, their goals, their dreams, and how much house can I afford to buy? We've got massive shadow demand, we've got low inventory, and now we've got increasing affordability in a market that has already been appreciating with declining, massively declining affordability. What happens when affordability increases? Folks, just do the math. This is quite simple. All right, let's look at the forecast here. Mortgage rates next year. Currently, the Mortgage Bankers Association, otherwise known as the MBA, is forecasting a baseline mortgage rate ending next year at 6.1% and reaching 5.5% at the end of the following year. Now, what have I been telling you, even though I suck at predicting interest rates? I have been predicting that mortgage rates would settle in the 5s. Maybe I'll be right. Maybe I'll be wrong. Who knows? Of all my great predictions, and there have been many, most of them have come true. The one that hasn't is interest rates. I've been pretty bad on the interest rate predictions. So this is not my prediction, it's their prediction. But it was mine too. I've been saying that for a while, 5% range. Okay, as treasury rates decline and the spread narrows. Now, we're going to look at the spread between the Fed rate and mortgage rates on a future episode. I got some good data on that, some good charts on that. So look for that in an upcoming episode, okay? Now, what is NAR forecasting? National Association of Realtors, largest trade lobby organization in the world, 1.6 million members. Recently, they've come into some trouble with that big lawsuit. We've talked about that. But anyway, they're pretty good at doing forecasts, right? NAR's got a big research division. They've been doing this for decades. And I got to give them credit. They're pretty good at their research. So they're forecasting a 30-year fixed rate mortgages at 6.3%. It is possible we will see mortgage rates in the high 5% range but it is very unlikely that we'll see 30-year rates in the 3.5% to 5% range as we saw for over a decade, right? So I agree with that. We're not going to see those COVID-era rates again unless we have another big crisis. But the Fed has probably achieved their soft landing pretty well. And guess what else? Remember how when rates were so low and money was free, we talked about how they had to reload the gun? Okay, they've done that. The Fed is now reloaded. They are ready for the next crisis because now rates are way up. And when the next crisis occurs, they can act again with easing the money supply, with helicopter money, with QE. They've reloaded. Okay, folks, yeah, another crisis will come. You can be sure of that. There will be another crisis. There will be war. There will be pandemics. There will be, global warming, whatever. There's always going to be a crisis. There's always going to be a crisis. But now they've reloaded. They've restocked the shelves. And now they have the weapon, the tool to fight the crisis, the next crisis. So I don't know. I was thinking Jerome Powell kind of overdid it. He probably did. He probably overcorrected. And I've been critical of him, but whatever. The past is the past. We have what we have, and we are where we are. And right now, the Fed is kind of looking pretty good. I got to give them some credit. Little too much pain for a year and a half, overreacted, overcorrected. But now, look, prices didn't even go down. They went up during this overcorrection time. So you just take it for what it's worth, the future, right? Anyway, let's talk about the absolute disgusting perils in Washington, D.C. Folks, these are the people you are paying to run our government, and their escapades are just insane. But I got to tell you, the one thing we need to solve this problem more than any other is term limits. We got to have term limits. Everybody looks at the president and they think, the president, this, that, and the other thing, right? Sure. That's only 4 to 8 years. We have got to end this idea of career politicians. Nobody should be a politician as a career. A politician should be something you do for a short period of time. You leave your business, you leave your district, you come and you serve, and then you go, right? We need term limits. We need term limits. The other thing is most people, both on the left and the right, will agree that government is bloated, corrupt, and inefficient. Less so on the left, right? But definitely the people on the right and the libertarian side, they will agree with that. Well, look, if there is corruption in government, one way to fight corruption is it will expand and contract with the size of government. So make government smaller and the corruption will be smaller, right? Simple prescription for that. Anyway, let's talk to the DC madam and hear about this story. It's pretty interesting. It's my pleasure to welcome Henry Vinson to the show, who is author of Confessions of a DC Madam. And what you will hear today may well blow your mind. So, Henry, welcome. How are you?
Great, thank you. And thank you for having me.
Yeah, the pleasure is all mine. So, what an amazing story, really. Give us a general overview of Confessions of a DC Madam.
Sure. I ran the largest gay escort service that's ever been exposed in Washington, D.C., and my ultimate downfall was precipitated by the fact that I provided escorts to a CIA asset named Craig Spence. He used my escorts to blackmail politicians and other power brokers, and I ultimately became the fall guy for a sprawling conspiracy whose cover-up was engineered at the pinnacle of the Bush-1 administration.
And did you say, before you go on, I don't know if I heard that correctly, did you say a CIA asset?
That's right.
So this was basically an undercover, a spy. I mean, spies work for the CIA. I can't say undercover cop, right? Did he actually buy the services of your outfit?
Yes, Craig was a client. He spent about $20,000 a month.
Wow. Oh my gosh, that's amazing. By the way, just to talk about money for a moment, was your average client spending that kind of money?
No, the average client was spending about $200 per call.
Okay, 200. And would they have, generally like a once a week call or more or less often? I'm just curious how that works.
Well, a lot of them would actually call almost every day. It's sort of like seeing a different movie. They couldn't find exactly what they were looking for, so a lot of them would call every day. But Craig Spence, he did a lot of business because he had some great parties at his house. And his house was set up for blackmail. He was a D.C. power broker and a CIA asset, and his upscale D.C. home was bugged for audiovisual blackmail. And he even arranged midnight tours of the White House for some of the escorts who I employed.
Unbelievable. So basically, he was working for the CIA, and when you say his house was wired for audiovisual blackmail purposes, I mean, he wasn't doing that on behalf of the CIA, right? That was his own outside gig. I assume that the CIA isn't blackmailing our own politicians, are they?
Well, Craig was a lobbyist. He had been an ABC News correspondent. Craig did quite a few things, and apparently he got a lot of leverage to do some great lobbying by the information that he obtained on his clients. He would have lavish parties at his house in upper northwest D.C., and it would look like a who's who of Washington, D.C. There would be media personalities, government officials, cabinet members. So it was a pretty interesting place to be.
I bet it was. And what years did you operate as a madam? You know, so give us an idea as to what administrations were in office and so forth.
In the mid-'80s, the end of 1985 to about 1990, in that area.
Okay, in that area. And so Craig Spence turned you in, or what happened there? You said that was your downfall.
Well, Craig Spence wasn't my downfall, but again, Craig Spence was a D.C. power broker and a CIA asset, and his house was bugged for audiovisual blackmail. And he didn't mastermind my downfall, but the very fact that I became enmeshed with Spence ultimately led to my downfall. I was privy to Spence's blackmail enterprise, his collusion with the Secret Service, and also his pandering of children to his power broker cronies. So I ultimately became the man who knew too much. The shadowy network that protected Spence was affiliated with the highest levels of the government, and I had become a major liability.
Wow, that is just amazing. And so what happened to you?
I was called to Craig Spence's house one evening, and he wanted me to come meet someone who was a cabinet member. And the government accounting office, GAO for the government, had called inquiring about some charges on a government credit card. And they were recurrent charges. And this was for a cabinet member. And I simply told this credit card company that they should inquire with the cardholder because it was a personal nature and they should get that information from him. So they called me over, Craig and this individual, and they wanted me to submit blood studies report. That's what they came up with, that they wanted me to do. I didn't feel comfortable doing that, and the last words I had with them were, I can withstand a background investigation, can you? And then within a few hours, the Secret Service served search warrants, and I ended up being indicted on a 43-count RICO indictment.
RICO is the racketeering indictment. Oh, interesting. Okay. So what happened after that? Were you arrested? Did you serve time? Or?
I was arrested, and eventually I was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison. And so I did end up entering a plea agreement with the government, and I was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison. I was represented by Greta Van Susteren. She was my defense attorney.
Interesting. Boy, you got all kinds of famous people around you. And so what happened at trial? Did you actually end up serving time?
Well, I did end up serving time, and I was very disappointed with the way Greta Van Susteren represented me, because the government accomplished its two objectives when she was my attorney, and that's my silence and imprisonment. And at the onset of my case, she filed an 11-page motion to mandate the release of my clientele list, and that the government had previously seized from me. And Greta argued that the names of my patrons should be released because if the government's assertion was accurate and my escort service was in actuality a prostitution ring, my clients aided and abetted a criminal enterprise. She said that she felt forcing the government to disclose my clientele would abate its zealous prosecution of me. But the U.S. Attorney for D.C., they opposed that motion, and the judge ended up siding with Greta, or with the government, and they sealed the record. So the judge ruled that they didn't have to disclose it.
Wow. So you kept your story quiet for so long. Why did you decide to tell the world now? And what did you hope to accomplish with coming out about the story?
Well, I have two objectives for telling my story. First, I want to tell my side of the story because I've been subjected to a 25-year campaign of character assassination by the media. And second, I believe the American political system has become a wayward aberration of the ideas that it was built upon. And I believe that blackmail has played an integral role in hijacking our political system. And so those are the two main reasons that I'm telling my side of the story after 25 years.
I want to ask you, what are your thoughts about how we can fix the system? I'm sure you have some. You certainly have identified some of the problems. The first question I might ask you about that is, do you think, and I think I know the answer in advance probably, should prostitution be legal?
Well, I think that it should. I personally think that it should. I think that people should be able to do what they want to do in regards to sex between consenting adults. And
other things on fixing the system?
Well, I think the biggest problem is America's not aware because the media doesn't report it. And sunlight disinfects, and I think that it has to come to light. The media doesn't report blackmail because 90% of the media is controlled by 6 major corporations. So I think in order to fix the problem, it has to be brought out so people can actually see it. And that's just something that doesn't seem to happen.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. We have this media consolidation. Thank God for the internet, because if it wasn't for that, people would all really be hearing the same thing. There'd be almost no alternative news, where you can hear about other stories. And it really boggles my mind, Henry. When I turn on TV, especially when traveling, and I turn on CNN, BBC, Fox, anything, in a hotel room, it's like the same 8 stories all day. It's just, you'd think there's nothing else going on in the world. It is amazing how the coverage is so, it's just so condensed into a relatively small number of stories,
Well, I agree. I think you're right. And in my story, the Washington Post covered up what the Washington Times was reporting. And I've spent years thinking about that. And I'm just amazed that happened. And I'm still amazed that happened. But I'm not a conspiracy theorist. And over the years, I've tried to understand the motivations of the Washington Post to cover up a conspiracy that undermined American democracy. And what I came up with is shortly after the CIA was formed in 1948, the agency initiated Operation Mockingbird, which was its campaign to influence the media. And the CIA's Frank Wisner oversaw Operation Mockingbird, and Wisner boasted that he was the maestro of a mighty Wurlitzer organ because he was capable of playing any propaganda tune that he desired. And in the suppressed book, Catherine the Great, journalist Deborah Davis reported that Wisner tapped then Washington Post publisher Philip Graham to be the CIA's point man to help it infiltrate the media. And Davis reported that Washington Post publisher Philip Graham stocked the Washington Post with writers and editors who had intelligence background. And she examined the connections between the CIA and Ben Bradley, and that was the Washington Post executive editor when the paper was covering up Spence's CIA connections and the blackmail activities. And in Catherine the Great, Davis wrote that Bradley produced CIA propaganda while he was the press attaché in Paris in the 50s during the Cold War. Bradley said she was lying and pressured the publisher of the book, Harcourt Brace, to withdraw the book publication. And it was pulped. And Davis then sent several Freedom of Information Act requests to the government and State Department, and documents confirm that Bradley churned out CIA propaganda at the behest of the CIA chief. So ultimately, Bradley was the one lying about his CIA connections. And that's what I think is a lot of the issue. I think the CIA is much more involved in the media than many of us believe.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. That's very unfortunate. It really is. So I got to ask you about your sexual orientation. Do you think that had a big impact on the way you were treated by the government and the Secret Service?
Well, I do. I think that my sexual orientation, because I ran a gay escort service during the Reagan and Bush 1 administration, I think that had a big impact because many of the politicians and power brokers that I provided with escorts, these were closeted Republicans. And it would have been a death knell to their careers if it came out that they were soliciting the services of gay escorts. So I think that did have a big impact on it.
And keeping in mind, just to remind the listeners, this was quite a few years ago, so things have changed, obviously, or at least we think so. But I just got to ask this question. Did you have mostly Democrat or Republican clients? I got to ask that question, right?
Well, I was there during the Bush 1 and Reagan administrations, and we were very, very busy with the Republicans. So I think that the Republicans, I think they keep gay escort services fairly busy.
Right. Well, but to be fair, though, to the Republicans, there were more of them around because those were the administrations in that day. So, there weren't as many Dems around Washington, so
that's right.
On a per capita basis, I'd like to know if that's true nowadays. I mean, now there have been some other scandals, and I was going to ask you about that. Deborah Jeane Palfrey, right, dubbed the D.C. Madam in 2008. To yourself. Are you similar to her, or what? Tell us about that. You write about it in the book, right?
I do. Deborah Jeane Palfrey, she was dubbed the D.C. Madam in 2008, and the media also dubbed me the D.C. Madam during my story. And we both ran escort services in Washington, D.C., and both of us were dubbed the D.C. Madam by the press. But the federal government subjected both Ms. Palfrey and me to a crucible that was designed to ensure our silence and ultimately crush us. And Ms. Palfrey was merely running an escort service when the Justice Department smacked her with a 14-count RICO indictment. But it walloped me with a 43-count RICO indictment.
Wow. And was Deborah's service gay or heterosexual or both?
No, her service was heterosexual, so she had women.
Yeah, right. Okay, interesting. I mean, what else do you want us to know? Maybe a question I haven't asked you yet.
Blackmail. I think that blackmail is the real focus of the book, and kingdoms, empires, syndicates, and unscrupulous groups have deployed political blackmail since time immemorial. And in my experience, blackmail plays an integral role in the American political process. But blackmailers and their blackmail targets would never divulge such misconduct for the obvious reasons. Blackmailers would be subjected to criminal prosecution, and their blackmail targets would be subjected to either prosecution and or persecution for the conduct that led them to be blackmailed in the first place. So political blackmail is almost never made public, and if it does become public, it's usually years after the fact. Look at J. Edgar Hoover, for example. He blackmailed people for decades, and his blackmailing only emerged years after his death. And according to John F. Kennedy's secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, Hoover had the dirt on Kennedy's extramarital affairs and blackmailed him into accepting Lyndon Johnson as his running mate in 1960. And Hoover never publicly divulged that he was a blackmail artist, and both Martin Luther King and John Kennedy never divulged that they had been targeted by Hoover for blackmail. And several accounts have since emerged that the mafia was blackmailing J. Edgar Hoover because he was homosexual, which is one of the reasons why Hoover said the mafia didn't exist at all until there was overwhelming evidence of its existence. So there's a real precedent for blackmail, and I think blackmail is much more prevalent than what many of us believe.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and you see how that can really skew things like Hoover not saying, not admitting that there's really a mafia, right? I mean, that's a dangerous thing, and if he didn't have to worry about that, that whole story could have been different, right? The American public seems to relish these sex scandals, obviously. That's no news to anybody, right? Especially when they involve, famous, powerful people. But how much do we really know, of what goes on in the shadowy underworld of the elite that we don't know, that, you know?
Well, in my experience, the government and the media work in tandem to prevent the American people from learning about the unbelievable debauchery that illicit sexcapades of our power elite in Washington, D.C. is essentially the present-day Babylon. But Americans are just naive about the depravity of their political and their politicians, who are endowed with a potent alchemy of power, arrogance, and lust. And I think that they just don't know because the media doesn't report on a lot of it. And I think Bill Clinton and Eliot Spitzer are merely two examples of innumerable politicians who put their careers and families on the line because of their sexual addictions or compulsion.
You were exposed to, many amazing things, heavy drug use, orgies, pedophilia, maybe. Tell us about that.
I was consistently pressured by DC power brokers to provide child prostitutes to their power broker cronies, but I refused to have anything to do with child prostitution. And the federal government was aware of this fact.
I'm curious, what ages did these people ask for? That's disgusting. What ages? I mean, they specifically requested that from you, huh?
They specifically requested it. And Nick Bryant has written a book, The Franklin Scandal, which goes into great detail. He spent many years researching that. And there were very young children, 10, 12 years old. And many, many lives were destroyed with Lawrence King and Craig Spence. Craig Spence ran his own underage escort service, if you will.
Wow. Unbelievable. Okay, so anyway, any of the more sinister things you were exposed to? So you talked about, was there more there? That I kind of interrupted you, so I wanted to make sure you finished.
Oh, no. That's fine. And the federal government, as I was saying with the interstate child prostitution, the federal government was aware of this fact because I told my government debriefers about an interstate pedophile network that was providing D.C. politicians and power brokers with children. But the Department of Justice, Secret Service, and FBI, they covered up that pedophile network. So I think that's the worst thing that I was exposed to.
Yeah, wow, it sure is. How do you know they covered it up, though? How do you know they didn't investigate it and try and stop it?
Well, the Franklin Scandal, which Nick Bryant has written that book, it's still not out. It's still pretty much ignored by the mainstream media. And there's grand jury testimony. There's many, Nick put many years into that book. So there's lots of overwhelming evidence, and it's corroborated by many sources in the media, that did occur.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What happened? So Craig Spence died in 1989, and he was found dead in room 429 at the Boston Ritz-Carlton, the city's most expensive hotel. Do you know what happened to him? I mean, how much controversy is there surrounding his death?
Well, at the time, there was quite a bit of controversy, and he did die in 1989. He was in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, and he left this note, apparently, that he hereby resigned. He left some sort of note on the mirror, I believe, if I recall correctly. But I don't want to speculate on whether it was suicide or whatever, but it was rather unfortunate and rather untimely. But Craig did become a very strange creature. He became drug addicted, and he certainly had his share of problems the last bit of his life. But the most interesting thing is D.C. grand jury was impaneled, and it exonerated Craig Spence and hammered me with a 43-count RICO indictment. But he was exonerated.
Did it exonerate him posthumously or when he was alive?
When he was alive. He was never convicted. Nothing ever happened to him.
Interesting. Was your life ever threatened while you were D.C., madam? I mean, you dealt with some powerful people, obviously, and they wanted to keep things hush-hush, I'm sure, and would probably go to great lengths to make sure you don't talk.
Well, the threat that I'll never forget was discharged by someone named Tony. I never knew his last name, but he was affiliated with the Blackmail operation that run by CIS at Craig Spence. And as I was saying earlier, Spence pressured me to provide him with child prostitutes, but I refused to pander children. And after Spence pressured me a number of times to provide him with children, I decided to quit dealing with him. And at that point, Tony and two of his thugs paid me a late-night visit. They discharged guns outside my window, busted up my apartment, and threatened to kill me, and if I didn't continue to provide escorts to Spence. And although I did continue to provide escorts to him, they never again asked for underage people.
You quoted the rate earlier, and you said people would pay $200 per hour, and that was in about, 1987?
That's right.
Yeah. So just because I'm an economist, I have to share with my audience, I did the inflation calculation on that, and today, based on the official stats, not the real inflation rate, that would be $413 per hour. So just wanted to share that little tidbit of trivia, $413 per hour.
Wow, that is interesting.
Yeah. I bet you never had anyone do that on an interview, right?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, okay, there's a new one for you. So, gosh, this is just an amazing story. Can you share any of the names of your clients? You talked about Craig Spence a lot, of course, but, have you shared other names, or do you want to share any now?
Well, I'm comfortable with naming names because I ran an escort service when the Reagan and Bush 1 administrations were in office. And under Reagan, no gay civil rights legislation was passed. And indeed, Reagan was once, he declared that homosexuals were mentally ill. But perhaps the greatest transgression of Reagan against the gay community was his silence about the AIDS epidemic spreading in the 80s. And although it was first identified in 81, Reagan didn't even mention it. But there are quite a few interesting people, and William Casey, he always comes to my attention because he had a rather unusual interest, and he liked escorts to ritualistically anoint him, rub him with oils, and he had erectile dysfunction, so the escorts would come back and talk about him. And other patrons of my escort service included Donald Gregg. He was the U.S. ambassador to South Korea during Bush's presidency. Charles Dutcher, the Associate Director of Presidential Personnel in the Reagan administration. Paul Ballack, the Labor Secretary, Elizabeth Dole's political personnel liaison to the White House. But Larry Craig is a great example of the hypocrisy of closeted Republicans that pervaded the Reagan administration with regards to gay rights, civil legislation. Craig developed quite a reputation for voting against gay legislation. Craig voted for a constitutional ban of same-sex marriage. He voted against expanding hate crimes to include sexual orientation. In fact, the Human Rights Campaign, the nation's largest gay and lesbian civil rights organization, gave him a 0% concerning his stance on gay rights legislation. So Senator Larry Craig proved to be a major hypocrite. And those are some of the more interesting people that use the service.
Interesting. And Larry Craig is still alive. So that's, some of the others that you mentioned have passed on now. So I was kind of looking up the names as you were talking about them, but I didn't catch them all. That's too fast for my typing speed. But very interesting. Wow, that's really quite interesting. I think one thing, though, that maybe you and the listeners have to adjust for a little bit in what you talked about, which is, I'm glad you shared that, is that, that was a different era, right? I mean, do you cut anybody a little bit of slack for it just being a different era? I mean, we're talking, 30, 40 years ago, right?
That's right. It's been almost 30 years ago, and it was a different era. I mean, now with things like Bruce Jenner, and that's not exactly on topic, but, things are definitely changing. Obviously, the Supreme Court's taking up the legislation now and on gay marriage and so forth. So it's certainly a different time. When you talk about these people, how they were in the past, and you think today, my gosh, that would seem incredible that you think that way today, but times they change, right? And as Obama says, they evolve, So, the blackmail thing is just amazing. This is an amazing, amazing story. What are you doing now? I mean, what have you been doing all this time? So you spent about 5 years in prison, right? That's right.
Yeah. And so that was from, about 1990 to 95? Is that about right?
1991 to 1995.
And what did you do after that? I mean, when you were out, you just wrote this book now, right? Or recently. What did you do all the other time?
Well, I think the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And that quote is near and dear to my heart because I've endured a number of tragedies in my life. And I've been determined not to let it destroy me. And in fact, it's galvanized my will and spurred me to reach for success. But Nietzsche should have said, what doesn't kill you often hurts like hell. Plus, I think living a good life's the best revenge. And I've managed to forge out a wonderful life. I went back to school. I went back to West Virginia University, got a master's degree in integrated marketing communications. And even before this happened, I was a commercially rated pilot and airplanes. I've since added a helicopter rating, flight instructor. So, and I went to mortuary school many, many years ago. And that's what I was doing in D.C., working as a funeral director and embalmer.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, what's next for you?
Well, what's next for me is just living life, just staying like I am now, furthering my education and just living a nice life, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Do you live in D.C. now?
I don't. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio now.
Uh-huh. So you're out of that whole circle. It would be probably pretty weird for you to be around D.C. Do you visit D.C. very often?
Well, I probably go up a couple times a year. I do, but I don't have any contact with anyone from my life 30 years ago.
Very interesting. Well, give out your website if you would. Tell people where they can get the book. Anything you want people to know, any resources, a Twitter feed, whatever.
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Henry Vinson, and the book's available at Amazon, and that's probably the best place to get it. But my website, henryvinson.com, and Confessions of a DC Madam. It's a great book, tells about blackmail, and it's pretty interesting, I think.
Yeah, the subtitle, Confessions of a DC Madam, The Politics of Sex, Lies, and Blackmail. And any closing thoughts so we can wrap up?
Sure. I'd like to tell your listeners that they should read Confessions of a DC Madam because it pulls back the curtain on the facet of American politics unlike any other book. It shows that blackmail plays an integral role in the American political process, and it also shows the ruthless lengths the government will take to silence those in the know.
Dealing with very powerful entities there. Well, Henry Vinson, thank you so much for joining us and exposing us to this amazing story and your amazing life.
Thank you so much for listening. Please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any episodes. Be sure to check out the show's specific website and our general website, hartmanmedia.com, for appropriate disclaimers and terms of service. Remember that guest opinions are their own, and if you require specific legal or tax advice or advice in any other specialized area, please consult an appropriate professional. And we also very much appreciate you reviewing the show. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher Radio or whatever platform you're using and write a review for the show. We would very much appreciate that. And be sure to make it official and subscribe so you do not miss any episodes. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode.